I'm really excited about our next two guests. I'm going to be handing it over to Anurima Bhargava. She is the founder and director of Anthem of Us, which is a strategic advisory and consulting firm promoting dignity, justice, and equity in education in the workforce. She has worked in the Justice Department under President Obama and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and continues to serve on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So we're really excited to have her here. And joining Anurima, we have Ronan Farrow, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist with The New Yorker. He's previously served as an anchor and investigative journalist at MSNBC and NBC News. He's the author of the groundbreaking bestseller Catch and Kill and host of the Catch and Kill podcast. We are thrilled to have him here at the summit. And so here for a fireside chat addressing the systems and patterns of abuse of power, please give it up for Anurima and Ronan.
Hey everybody. You guys having a good time? Yeah, that's what I love to hear. Well, it's about to get even more fun because look who we have here.
Look who we have here, really. We had so much to talk about already.
So much.
And then yesterday happened. So we're just going to start there and have fun as we go.
Great. Should we talk about yesterday? All right, let's talk about yesterday. You are the perfect person to ask about yesterday, my friend.
I love that you're going to start this way. So yesterday, for those of you who may have missed what was going on the other side of the country, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, resigned, and after a 165-page report that came out from the New York Attorney General the week before about 11 women who had allegations of sexual harassment and a hostile work environment in the governor's office. And a few hours before he resigned, we had yet another extraordinary article and piece of investigative reporting by Ronan about some of the other ways, this long pattern of ways in which the governor and others have actually tried to intervene. So in the case of your article, it was about the Moreland Commission. So tell us about the commission and why it's so poignant that that's what the governor was trying to intervene in.
Attempts to intervene in some ways that I think will be relevant to this group because it makes clear that this isn't just behavior by one actor. It really is about systems that tolerate, I think, certain forms of abuse for too long. And you have two sides of the coin, the systems that lead to that abuse being met with a culture of impunity, and then the consequences for human beings, which, as you mentioned, are laid out in that report and in a lot of public reporting from me and other people about the underlying harassment. But this story, as you said, is not about that. This story was about a 2014 commission that Governor Cuomo started to root out corruption in Albany. New York is one of the most corrupt states in the country by a whole lot of measures. There's a lot of different ways to slice the data, but there are a lot of lists that hold that to be true. And there were a series of prosecutions that put political pressure on the governor to do something. And he did something. He created this commission, and he stocked it with very serious prosecutors. And then he proceeded to, when those serious prosecutors used their mandate to issue subpoenas and went after big entities in New York politics, dark money groups, allies of Cuomo's, people who were directly giving to Cuomo, he started to get uncomfortable. And we have a bunch of people in this story going on the record for the first time. The main investigator on that commission, one of the chairs of that commission saying they were threatened and bullied, and even up to the point where process servers who were issuing subpoenas were being called and told to come back, over the wishes of the state attorney general's office, all kinds of improper stuff from a procedural standpoint that seemed designed to shield Governor Cuomo from accountability.
And this is part of a really familiar playbook, not only by Cuomo, right? So let's talk about the ways in which that was part of what happened with the allegations of sexual harassment too. And then I want to broaden it to all the other ways in which you've documented the same playbook being used over and over again by people who are in power. So let's talk a little bit about Cuomo and the sexual harassment allegations, which I know you've had a chance to cover, and the fact that it's a very similar pattern of deny, discredit, destroy anyone who's coming through.
Well, and discredit and destroy in a way that I think tests the systems that are supposed to be in place to prevent that. So one of the instances that's gotten the most attention out of this story yesterday was some of your former colleagues at the Department of Justice in 2014 were alarmed to find that Cuomo, in an incident that hadn't been reported before, after the top prosecutor in Manhattan, Preet Bharara, announced that he was going to be inspecting the interference with and ultimately premature closure of this anti-corruption commission. In response to that, Governor Cuomo called the White House, reached Valerie Jarrett, who's a senior Obama advisor at the time, and ranted and raved and said, he's your guy, he's out of control, started excoriating him, insulting him, and seemed to be suggesting that he wanted the White House to do something about this investigation into him, which he was so unhappy with. And spoiler alert, you could explain better than I the elements of the crime, but there are actually a variety of crimes and also breaches of state ethics rules that come into play when you have a sitting official like that asking the White House to interfere with a criminal investigation. The classic one being obstruction of justice, and the particulars of whether he could have been brought up on obstruction charges are down to what would have had to be investigated at the time. Exactly what he said. Was he aware? He was certainly aware of the investigation because he was telling Valerie Jarrett, here's what the investigation is and it's terrible. Awareness is one element. Corruptly interfering is another. I mean, it has a lot of the hallmarks. And so we talked to a lot of legal experts, including the former Deputy Attorney General, who got the call frantically from the White House with them saying, essentially, in sum and substance, we think Andrew Cuomo is obstructing justice here. And certainly he and many of the experts we talked to said it has a lot of those elements and it could have at least approached that crime. And even if not that, it could be an impeachable offense. It could be something that brings up an official on state ethics violations again. So in this case, you have an illustration of systems that worked in one sense, right? Because an official at the White House did the right thing and stopped the call and marched straight to the White House lawyer's office and said, hey, I think this is wrong. And the White House lawyer said, yeah, it's wrong, and called the Department of Justice. So you actually had bumpers on to some extent. But it also illustrates some of the downsides, one of which is if you have someone who's very powerful and who has succeeded in a kind of bullying leadership style, relying on the arguments you described, deny, bully, threaten in response, and that person has succeeded in prevailing through those arguments for a long time, it can be hard to break through that. People were very intimidated by and frightened of Andrew Cuomo and his use of power in a bullying way, and that is something that runs through a lot of my different stories.
Sure. I mean, I think the Justice Department piece of this is a small sliver of the ways in which we saw an attempt to intervene that didn't work. In the Justice Department, we always call the Southern District of New York that Preet was the U.S. Attorney and the Sovereign District of New York, because they don't actually listen to what the Justice Department would say. Anyway, so maybe not the right way to go about trying to stop something in the Sovereign District of New York, but a lot of the tactics are ones that were used in his own office, right? And we saw that obviously with Cuomo, and you documented that so clearly, not only with Harvey Weinstein and the ways in which in Catch and Kill, and for those of you who are not familiar, Ronan and two New York Times reporters really broke groundbreaking stories on Harvey Weinstein that really led to the movement that we saw all around the country of those of us who hadn't had a chance to come forward, and so I'm so grateful to you for the amount of attention and detail that you paid to the ways in which not only were there incidents of violence, but what led up to them and what came after them. And that's what I really want to talk to you about is what are those systems and patterns of abusive power. We see them with Cuomo, we saw them with Weinstein, and so in their own universe, right, that they controlled, what are the ways in which they kept power and made sure that the allegations of harassment, of violence, of discrimination in many ways didn't come through?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. And it's very moving to me anytime I hear that people feel that this kind of accountability journalism can and has made a difference. And I think that's part of what we should talk about today. If we're looking at how do you dismantle abusive systems and how do you strengthen systems that create accountability, I think independent reporting of one kind or another is the key to a lot of that. Knowledge and facts allow us to take action and expose wrongdoing and stop it. And that could amount to the right systems in a private context at a company. These stories are riddled with accounts of HR departments that didn't function correctly, of document retention policies that allowed things to go missing or be destroyed. Major corporations with very high-paid lawyers that were in the practice of having secret settlement agreements to cover things up, and locking those settlement agreements into filing cabinets that then never saw the light of day. I mean, these are all systems that cut against the kind of transparency that I'm talking about, and that, to answer your question, allow abusers to keep abusing with impunity. So there are a lot of answers to the question. People are responsive to the tactic of intimidation and fear, and that's a hard thing to go against. Andrew Cuomo, Harvey Weinstein, Les Moonves, they all have in common a sort of bullying, rough-hewn leadership style that creates a situation where, when I set about making reporting calls, to use one small example, I get a lot of, why would I ever talk about this? In some of these cases where you're talking about sexual violence specifically, it's the darkest moment of someone's life and it's traumatizing to talk about. B, there's all these systems in place to silence people and prevent them from talking, whether that's non-disclosure agreements that are legally designed to prevent that, or it's someone just being terrified that their career is going to be wiped out, because in some of these cases, someone in a leadership role has explicitly told them that their career is going to be wiped out if they speak. Even in this context, which is not a sexual abuse story, the prosecutor who ran investigations on that anti-corruption commission was really fearful to go on the record even all these years later, and really went back and forth on, should I do it, can I do it, what are the consequences going to be for my career? And so, that gives you a sense of some of the obstacles, I think, and some of the reasons why powerful people who are routinely abusive become repeat offenders. And I think it also gives the beginnings of some clues on, okay, how do you break through that ultimately?
So let's talk about that. In particular, I want to talk about it in the higher education and K through 12 context, which is what a lot of people here spend their time investing in and engaging in. So when I was at the Justice Department, one of the problem that we were trying to fix was that, in many ways, was that so few people reported, right? So we had at most 5 to 8% of students who experienced any kind of sexual harassment or assault on campus would actually come forward. And that's because they had two options. One was to stay silent or to go through a formal reporting process where they would be subject to a great deal of scrutiny. And we can talk about all the ways in which that's been changed in the last couple of years and which way works. But just to have those two choices be the ones that you have available to you is something that hasn't really worked. It hasn't worked in schools, and it hasn't worked in workplaces and communities either. And so when you think about how you've looked at the process, the difficulties in someone coming forward, and this like singling out, like it's basically Weinstein's operation was someone came forward, they picked them off, and then there was the next one. And so how do you actually think about what we need to invest in to try to change that around, right? And is it other kinds of spaces for folks? Is there other kind of systems we need to have in place to really make sure that people don't feel like they have two not so great options?
Part of my response when someone says, some of the reporting has had an impact or meant something to them, in addition to it being personally meaningful to me, I also invariably, my mind goes to, the credit for those kinds of disclosures really does rest with the sources ultimately. And I couldn't break any of these stories without those people who wrestle with these decisions in the way I just described, and who ultimately are, it's an overused word, but I sincerely believe brave in doing something in the public interest that at times, at the outset anyway, as these stories are breaking, feels like it's against their personal interests. So I think part of the answer to the question you pose about how we sort of teach this kind of reform is philosophical and high level. It's how do we teach young people, sure, but also for the people in the room who are more in higher education, people who are starting to contemplate their careers and their goals in an adult life, to be brave in that way and to reinforce with them that, with journalism specifically, it's enshrined in the Constitution for a reason. We have whistleblower protection laws for a reason. But more importantly than that, because you're not always going to be dealing with a story that has a journalistic ramification, just the importance of speaking truth to power, even in your own office, and spotting when something is wrong in terms of misconduct that's been directed at you or at someone else, and doing the right thing and reporting it. So I do think an important part of this solution is in the hands of educators. I think that we have to reinforce at every step of how we educate people that that's a really important value, not just because it's right in the abstract, but because it's what keeps our systems in private companies and in government up and running effectively and prevents abuse and waste and fraud. And then when you talk about empowering those kinds of disclosures, it's not just teaching people to undertake them when they see something wrong, it's also creating systems, to get at your point, that empower them to do that and don't scare them away from doing that. And I've seen in so many of these stories that abuse flourished because you didn't have proper channels of reporting where people felt empowered, they felt they could safely report misconduct. And I've also seen some examples where, people felt more encouraged to. I think that there are some simple things to start out. One is, private companies should have robust policies that prevent the use of non-disclosure agreements to silence people with serious criminal allegations or harassment-oriented allegations, if we're talking about sort of the Me Too stuff. You need to have opportunities for confidential reporting that really can be depended upon. I think there are some interesting experimentations that have happened in the last few years with not just confidential channels for reporting, but channels for reporting that sort of hold allegations in escrow until they reach a certain level of numerosity. Right. So okay, I can come forward, I can lodge something in a way that might help another coworker, but if it turns out there isn't that strength in numbers, that won't trigger a reaction necessarily if that's not what I want to do immediately. I think that opens up yet another avenue and another category of people who might be hesitant to speak because what's running through their mind is, what if I'm the only one? What if I'm alone going up against this? So it's about designing these systems, which obviously apply not just at companies, but at schools of all levels. And it's about, I think, teaching and reinforcing the importance of those systems.
And I'd add, just to shout out to many in the room who've been working on these kinds of spaces, that there's so much ambiguous trauma that you can't really evidence, right? The everyday, the ways in which, we're talking about serious criminal allegations, we're talking about harassment, but also the ways in which people feel like they are, not worthy, to give a sense of like the ways in which we think about what is necessary for people to feel supported and safe. And we had a conversation here last year, I had it with Tony West from Uber, about what does it mean to move from like what is a liability culture to a safety culture, right? And how would that feel for folks, right? And what does that mean for companies and education and how we do training, which is that everyone is focused on like, how do we make sure we're not liable for something, as opposed to how do we make sure people feel safe? And in your reporting, what are the ways, you talked a little bit about this already, what are the ways in which you feel like, what do we need to make that shift, and what do we need to really support people in doing, to really think much more about safety than they are about, covering up whatever it is that they're doing, right? This silent culture that is totally what happened with Harvey Weinstein and certainly what happened with Cuomo too.
Well, I think at an institutional level, we need to all play our part in just participating in a culture that encourages disclosure. So Uber is a great example of a company that's really grappled with this. They had a lot of cultural problems. at multiple levels of the company. They had safety issues. And they, I think, have had a mixed track record of confronting that, but have at various times, I think, at least gestured towards the right direction in saying, okay, we're going to air our dirty laundry and present unflattering stats about harassment levels within the company or various other indicators of problems proactively. We're going to self-report. And I think that's one important value that educators can actually instill in people at different levels too. Again, going back to all of this being underpinned really meaningfully by education and by, even at a high level, even just philosophically, just teaching people values, having a values-based education system and values-based curricula. To teach people that self-reporting and transparency is important is a really meaningful thing. And I think that, that kind of education and that value running through it all the way from kindergarten can have a cascading effect up to and including executives at companies like Uber. And not enough of that value being reinforced can, I think, create a lot of problems. And for educational institutions, you need to model that same behavior. We've had a lot of scandals at particularly higher education institutions where the impetus has been to cover things up because that feels more protective or easier from a liability standpoint. And so, people in this room, I'm sure, will have other specific ideas on what you can do to achieve that. But I do think encouraging both individuals and entities, whether they're educational or they're private companies or startups, like some of the ones in this room, to do it themselves is just hugely important.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the ways in which we tell some of these stories. And so in the last couple years, since the chance, in last April, since I would have had a chance to talk with you here on this stage till now, Catch and Kill has come out in many different forms, right? So we've been able to hear it, we've been able to see it in podcast version on HBO, and I wanted just to ask about how you think, if there are particular platforms, are there particular ways in which you think stories that can be challenging, that can be re-traumatizing, are there ways that we should think about telling those stories? And did you sort of intentionally think about that in actually being able to share the story of Harvey Weinstein and investigative reporting around it and so many others that are included in Catch and Kill with the world in multiple platforms? And so what advice would you have to all of us about how we should think about that and how we should think about these kinds of stories that don't have voice?
Well, I'm grateful to have you ask that question framed as, how did you come to this successful model of it being a transmedia project? Because, I really just careened through these different versions of this project that, it was based in part on existing print reporting that I'd done, which had lived in one form that was much more dry and much more clinical in The New Yorker. And then there was a meta story that I told in Catch and Kill, which you mentioned, the book, which was much more stylized and rigorously reported and fact-checked. It was going to be under a microscope, so it all had to hold up, and it did. But also, it was important to me because it had already reached an audience in one form as that sort of just the facts, ma'am, clinical, cold assessment. It was important to me to do something different, which was telling a propulsive story from a more personal standpoint. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done writing that book professionally because both some of the obvious ramifications of obviously I had a lot of incoming because it was adversarial and confronting in a lot of ways. It was a story about me being spied on and followed and threatened in various ways, and losing my job over this work, which then in turn, in telling that story, got me more of that blowback. But also in some non-obvious ways creatively, I had to really be vulnerable and talk about a lot of really tough things in my life. And so I knew that because that was a different and new challenge, the tone had to be different and more personal and more emotional in some ways. And I was really happy to find that land with another audience that was totally different and in some ways wider. And then after that, there was, as you said, a podcast based on it, which I started working on late in the process of writing the book. And it really was just, I think, a product of us being in a volatile moment in terms of how people consume media. And I had heard stories bubbling up about other reporters working on podcasts to accompany their books. And I think it sparked something a little competitive in me. And I thought, oh, I have all these interviews that I'm doing anyway. Why not come up with a podcast version that is a companion piece that's not redundant? And it was a little bit of a creative challenge to come up with, okay, what does that look like? Because to my knowledge, actually, despite the fact that I had been hearing like, oh, people are getting into this space more, it's a brand new space too. And I wasn't aware of something exactly like what I landed on, which is I said, okay, there are these characters in the book which had to be cut down from a 1,000-page draft to a 400-page one. And you only spend a little time with them because they're appearing in this propulsive, very fast-paced narrative. And so what if we do anywhere from a half an hour to an hour with each of these characters, where you get their backstory, and you almost, the idea I had was that it was a little bit of a Rashomon, if you guys know that film, like a parade of different perspectives of the same events. So you get my perspective in this book, if you happen to read it, but then there's an incredible, brave whistleblower that I meet, and you get to relive those same events entirely from her perspective, going back to her childhood and the trauma that motivated her and her hopes and fears. And you get slivers of that in the book. I attempt to do justice to it, but it was no one character's story. And these episodes of this podcast could be. And it was incredible to see how that resonated with people. And I had no idea, honestly, when we launched that, and it was backbreaking work. Already you give yourself over to writing a book, and it takes over your life. And this was a particularly high-octane one. To then be, up until 4 a.m. every night editing podcast episodes, like sitting with a Pro Tools session open and moving around the music transitions. And thankfully, I had great producers and people that I was working with. But it was backbreaking work for everyone involved. And I wondered whether it was going to be worth it. And then to your point about the importance of different mediums and using them in different ways, it had a whole separate audience. It gives me great grief to say, as a lover of books, book audiences have gotten really small. And that was a hit book. I was very fortunate that people read and bought that book. But it was then a hit podcast, which was a much, much wider and quite different in some ways audience. By like several orders of magnitude. And so I do think in service of those sources' stories, which I thought were very important, it did right by them to get it out there in different mediums and to not just repurpose it, but to really put in the work to tell different stories that flowed from one another. And then, as you pointed out, there was this HBO documentary, which was based not on the book, but on the podcast. Right. And I hadn't planned that at all. My idea was, again, to this theme of how do you kind of ride the wave of all of our consumption habits changing, I said, well, I'm doing a podcast. Whitney Cummings' podcast, she puts a little camera in the room and she slaps those clips on YouTube, and they're great. Like, that's fun to watch. Like, let's do that. And I was fortunate to be in the nascent stages of a deal with HBO to make documentaries with them. And I said, just, working for them and wanting to be productive for them and give them a return on their investment, hey, what if we put a little lockdown, like just put a GoPro in the room and we shoot it? And of course, they're HBO and they're the best in the world in making documentaries. So they said, we don't know how to do that. Or we could hire like the best crews in the world and really like shoot it with 7 cameras in the room each time. And elaborate tracking shots and stuff. And it's still pretty simple because it's ultimately interviews with sources that I'm doing. But they really shot it beautifully. And then, I was launching the podcast a month after I was launching the book, just because that's the quickest I could get it out. And it was important to me to launch those things relatively in tandem. And HBO said, well, we're not going to just put these clips online. Like, we don't know how to do that. That's not our institutional expertise. We don't really know what you're talking about with these like YouTube versions of podcasts, and we have all these deals with cable companies and broadcasters that are, legacy deals from a different and older time in media where we actually have to put it on air if we do that. And I just said, don't worry about it. It was only supposed to be a value add for you. I'll like tweet some clips and we don't ever have to use this footage. And then to their immense credit, I had very little to do with that last version. But months later, because the podcast had, I think, resonated with people so much in audio form, they then came to me with the idea of, okay, what if we hand over this huge tranche of really visually compelling, beautifully shot interview footage to a couple of filmmakers who really have a vision for it. And they landed on the two guys who created Drag Race with RuPaul, which is amazing because, of course, Drag Race is the best. We've got some fans in the room. I hear mostly some of the ladies in the room love some Drag Race. RuPaul.
Yes.
Love RuPaul. But then also these two guys, Randy and Fenton, their company's called World of Wonder, are incredible sort of prestige documentary directors. They did it, I think, one of the best treatments of the Clinton Lewinsky saga. It's called Monica in Black and White, and it was the first time that she spoke, I think because she just needed to pay her legal bills essentially at that point. And so she did a town hall that they shot. And it was a similar challenge, I imagine, creatively, because they had this one element of Monica speaking for the first time and in a town hall, and actually, in a sign of the changing times, really getting some vicious treatment from audience members, like people.
In this moment, right?
Yeah, and so it's compelling to watch, but they spun that into this treatment of the entire saga with all kinds of archival footage, and they made it all black and white, and they stylized it, and it's for a long time been one of my favorite documentaries, and I was thrilled when those particular filmmakers wanted to take on this body of footage.
I'm glad they did, and we're going to have a chance, hopefully, to see that soon.
It has just launched, and you can stream it on HBO Max, and it's been incredible because there again, and this gets back to your initial question, finally, after all my digressions.
Yes, and then we have to wrap it up. So I'm gonna.
Well, it's been gratifying, and I think goes to the importance of teaching and telling stories in different mediums, because people now come up to me in the street who have streamed this on HBO Max or watched it on traditional HBO, and talk about how they read the book, they listened to the podcast, but they got something totally different out of seeing it and seeing the bravery of these sources and their faces as they're going through it. And so God bless the people who came forward and agreed to go on camera, and God bless the creative people who made it into something new yet again.
And I just think, again, grateful for the fact that at this moment where we're trying to erase histories, take out the teaching of our own histories, silence those who are coming forward, to have investigative reporting, to have documentary, to have all of these different sort of transmedia ways in which to bring out voices is so incredibly important. So thank you for being here with us and for all of this work. And I'm so grateful to be able to be on stage with you the day after yet another way in which you've really exposed the systems and patterns of abuse of power, things that we need to all pay a lot of attention to.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful for your years of upholding the rule of law and your service to the country, but also to everyone in this room. It was exciting to me to come here and have conversations with you and to be a part of this event, because this is not just remarks tailored for this room. I sincerely, in any context, would answer with an education-oriented question when I talk about how you see more accountability and less abuse. I really think the key to that is in a lot of the hands in this room, and using different forms of media in teaching in the most compelling way, reinforcing systems of accountability in our curricula, in our educational system, innovating in education at a time when there are such great challenges, which obviously you've been talking about through this event. That is as important as any mission that we have in this country right now, and I'm really counting on you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.